quoting an Afghani international protection applicant who arrived here on the 26th of January. "I've nowhere to go. I'm tired. I'm afraid I will die in the cold." That was when the government announced that it had no more accommodation for international protection applicants. And this is also on top of the 5,000 who have the right to leave direct provision but are still stuck in it because they've nowhere to go. And I find it baffling, Minister, that your party in particular made this a point of principle in designing the programme for government to end direct provision and to deal with these crises. And now we're slap bang in the middle of it. And I want to challenge what Leo Varadkar said here yesterday in answer to Thomas Pringle and Deputy Mick Barry at Leaders. He repeated it again in Morning Ireland this morning, that we, by saying to the government that you have created a housing crisis, successive governments over the last decade or more, that has led to this problem, that has led to the rise of the far right and the lack of accommodation for people who are seeking our protection. He says we're giving them an out. We are not giving them an out. It is an actual fact that this government has voted down every progressive manner and means that we've tried to introduce to end the housing crisis, which is at the root of the problem.
In terms of just responding to Deputy Smith's points, you know, you made a point in terms of ending direct provision. We have to recognise the changed landscape in terms of the numbers we're seeking to accommodate. The white paper was brought forward on the basis of 3,500 people coming through a system each year. Last year we saw 15,000 people coming through the system. So we have to respond and we have to recognise the changed landscape. And it is putting a huge and unique challenge. That on its own would have been a big challenge. But the fact that we also need to accommodate 55,000 people coming from Ukraine adds to that. And I think you know, and you know from your own first-hand experience, the difficulties in terms of securing accommodation and in the challenges that come from having to respond to inaccurate information, false information and manipulated information, even in terms of securing accommodation for very short periods of time. We have to look to put in place a system that accommodates migrants that is going to be larger, that is going to deal with more than 3,500 people per year. And that's going to have to be a medium to long-term project. But we also have the very immediate need to secure accommodation right now. And in answering that and in answering Deputy O'Murku's question, what we are doing is engaging with all government departments. So, for example, we've had support from the Department of Defence and the Taoiseach in terms of the use of Kilbride barracks for international protection applicants, in terms of the use of Mullingar in the next number of weeks for international protection applicants, and we are engaging with other government departments and agencies as well, so we can avoid the situation that you spoke of, Deputy Smith, that people are being left accommodated. There are people being left accommodated. That's not acceptable, and we will continue to work so we can end that.
Bríd Smith. Minister, I do indeed recognise the changed landscape that you referred to. But I wish you and your government would recognise that this is also taking place in the middle of a housing crisis. That seems to be a refusal by every member of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens to recognise that a huge part of the problem of accommodation is to do with the absolutely utter disgraceful housing crisis that we've found ourselves in. And that also gives rise to decent people who are supporting far-right rhetoric because they're 10, 12, 15 years on the housing list and they're confused about who gets what in this society. I don't blame them one bit for that. I do blame nasty, hateful far-right leaders, but not ordinary people who are confused by it. And I blame this government for not recognising that as a factor. And stop talking. Please get your ministers to, not necessarily the Green ones, but Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. There are TDs talking about pull factors, about problems with North African men. They need to shut up and deal with this in a decent way with a truly cross-party government effort that is going to look at this with urgency. There's lots of ways that things can be handled, but not in the half-shod way that it's being done at the moment. There needs to be more urgency and more coordination.
Deputy Smith, throughout all my communications from the first day of this the invasion and the challenges, I've recognised that we are responding to the war in Ukraine, to the increased number of migration in the context of a housing crisis here in Ireland. I've never not recognised that we have a housing crisis here in Ireland, and I've always been very explicit in terms of our response to Ukrainians and our response to international protection applicants. Our accommodation response is different and is separate to a response response to the needs of people experiencing the housing crisis here in Ireland. So there may be confusion out there in terms of our response, in terms of, as you said, who gets what, and that may be taken advantage of. But I've always been very clear, Ukrainians, international protection applicants, they don't get position on the social housing list, they don't get access to HAP, they are provided with the emergency accommodation, and we've brought on 75,000 beds of emergency accommodation. My department has brought that on in the last year. That is a scale of emergency accommodation that has never been delivered in the context of 1 year in this state before, and it is basic in many places, but it does provide shelter and security for individuals, and I've always been very clear that we've done that in the context of the wider response to the housing crisis, and I know you'll criticise our response to that, but we are working in that same context as well. Deputy O'Murco, in terms of the payments, there are issues. We are looking to reallocate staff into the payments unit. I accept there are providers who have experienced delays. We've paid out over €500 million to date, but I do recognise there have been delays, and we're looking to address this. And you're also right in terms of the need to streamline and speed up the assessment of people's international protection application. And the reason direct provision became, well, one of the reasons it became such a problem is that people were left in the system for so long. I want to recognise the work Minister McEntee and now Mr Harris is doing in terms of putting extra resources to looking into speeding up that process so people can get their determination earlier.